Hi, I'm Trino, and I will be telling you about adjudication in the BP format today. What we will be going through in today's workshop is firstly some judging principles you should adhere to as a judge yourself. Secondly, what are the principles of adjudicating the debate? And then thirdly, coming to the decision. Feel free to interrupt me with any and all questions that you may have. Just either write them in the chat or use the microphone or raise your hands in any way works fine. And the workshop is based on the judging rules and the judging briefings that are used at the European Universities Debating Championships and also World Universities Debating Championships. So that is the basis for this, and these rules are usually also used for all other BP tournaments unless specified otherwise. So starting with judging principles that you should adhere to as a judge yourself. So first of all, the judge should be a reasonable, globally informed, neutral observer. So this means that you should not use or have any specific knowledge of the emotion that is going to play into the round, but rather just have a general understanding of what things. Usually it is done or usually how this is interpreted is someone who probably, I don't know, reads the headlines of the important news and has some kind of understanding of the world. But especially if you're, for example, studying a degree in the fields that the emotion is on, or you have some specific knowledge from your country background or anything, you should not factor that into your adjudication, but rather assess this as a neutral person, not coming from any specific country, but rather as someone who's just generally informed. This, however, doesn't mean that you should not credit good analysis. You should still be able to understand complex concepts and be able to follow analysis, even if it is on a very high level, even if you should not insert yourself into the debate. You should be willing to be persuaded, which means that it kind of takes away your own opinion of the matter, but you should be able to be persuaded to either side of the motion in any given debate. You should be non-interventionist. So what this means is that you should not insert yourself or your own opinions into the debate, nor should you, I don't know, fill out analysis for teams, nor think that, oh, I thought this motion has a really cool argument, but none of the teams made it. So therefore, this debate is not as good as it could be, but rather what you should do is assess the debate as a whole and assess it as it happens rather than as it could happen or what potential it could have. You should be someone who fully understands the rules. Ideally, you do this by reading the judging manual of Worlds or Euros, but also hopefully this presentation will give you an overview of what those rules are or how to do general adjudication. And I think lastly, you should look past your personal opinion on the arguments made. So we should not discredit arguments if you personally do not agree with them, if you don't agree with the analysis, or if you don't agree with the impacts. This doesn't mean that you should discredit the argument, but rather you should like assess how well analyzed and how well made the argument is, rather than what you personally think of the motion. And again, this kind of goes together with the point that you should be willing to be persuaded. So these are the broad principles that you should adhere to when you are a judge. This applies to any round in any kind of a debate. This is probably also true for any other type of format, but specifically within the BP format, these are the things you should keep in mind when you are judging a debate. So what is the actual adjudication process, or what are the technical details and how you should go about adjudicating? So I think the thing that really, helps with judging is understanding how teams win debates. And I think that there is a very nice sentence that I found in one of the judging manuals or judge briefings for, I think, EUDC Athens in 2019. And it says that teams win debates by being persuasive with respect to the burdens on their side of the debate is attempting to prove within the constraints set by the rules of BP debating. And this is essentially also the main principle that you should adhere to as a judge when looking at the debate. You're seeing how persuasive teams are in terms of the burden that they are trying to prove. However, you're still adhering to the rules of BP within this, and you can't just judge the debate by, oh, this is more persuasive than the other thing, but rather you have to keep in mind the rules of BP debating. So that is the backdrop of how judging goes. And essentially we give teams wins based on which team is the best at achieving, well, the purpose of this debate, purpose of the sentence, or how they achieve the things laid out here. So how do we actually do this, how do we assess debates? So I think the first thing is when we are analyzing a debate or when we're watching a round and trying to figure out like which team is winning the debate, which is essentially your job as the judge, is to allocate the rankings between teams 1, 2, 3, 4. The first thing is we always have to be comparative within the analysis that we are assessing that is coming from the debaters. What this means is that you shouldn't just assess a debate by saying like team A did this, team B did this, team A is more persuasive, hence they win. This is a very simplistic understanding of a debate. However, what you should rather do is analyze how arguments interact with each other, how they mitigate, how they're being outweighed, etc. So what this can look like is that you're accrediting some when you're assessing two types of arguments, you can see, for example, which team was better at having very strong mechanistic analysis for one side and they were able to prove their point more. However, if the other team does a really good job of mitigating all of their impacts, they might be winning that round with the rebuttal that they did to that. Or alternatively, one team might be a lot better with the analysis that they're doing, but their impacts are less important, and the other team is able to outweigh the impacts that they get, even if their arguments are slightly less well mechanized, but still, believable and are still persuasive arguments. Then in that situation, if that team does excellent weighing in terms of why their impacts or why their outcomes are a lot stronger, then this is a team that might be winning the debate, because we are looking at how the analysis interacts with each other. This also means that we take into account how teams do rebuttal and how that damages the original arguments and how well they are able to recover from that. Hence, if you're very successful in taking down everything the other team does, and the other team is not very good at rebuilding that type of material, even if your own positive material is perhaps smaller or like is less stronger, it may still win because you're stronger in the comparative sense. So if you were able to take down a lot of the things, and then you look at what is left from after all of this engagement between the two teams, and then based on that we decide which team was more persuasive, which team was able to fulfill their burden more. The next thing is that we should generally assess which team has provided the best justification for their bench to win. This doesn't mean that only the gov bench wins or the op bench wins, but essentially they are the best team with the best justification for the side of the debate that they are defending. And this doesn't only include end conclusions or impacts, but also levels of mechanization and analysis. So for example, if one team is really elegant with the way they say, oh, this argument is going to bring about world peace and everyone is going to be happy. However, they do really bad analysis or they do no analysis as to prove how that comes about. And another team has smaller impacts. They're not trying to prove world peace, but something else, but they have really mechanistically proven that. Then in most cases, the team that is mechanistically a lot better is going to be the one winning that specific clash, because they have actually been able to prove the things they have set out to prove. So you, as a neutral observer or the neutral judge, you should assess how persuasive were the claims that they were making, how did they achieve their end impact that they're claiming to reach, and which one essentially you believe more, after also doing all of the comparative weighing between that. And most importantly, within BP, which I think sometimes happens with judges who come from other formats where there are not 4 teams, is people tend to fall into the pitfall of assessing teams together as the bench. So you assess together what opening government and closing government contribute and compare that to the opposition side. But what you should do is assess teams individually. So a winning CG or winning closing government team does not mean that the opening government team is necessarily going to come second. It is very easy for them to, for example, also lose the debate if they haven't done very good analysis. And the way we assess this is we assess each team's individual contribution to the debate and how they interact with the rest of the debate. Therefore, you can have someone bring a really, really fantastic extension and engage with all other teams, and they might come first, but their opening therefore might fall to be fourth if they fail to do all of those things very persuasively, or in any other type of combination of outcomes. So there is no clear, you don't have to be that if opening government wins, therefore closing government has to come second. So what we do is we assess each team individually, and more specifically, we assess each clash pairwise. So we compare. You should be able to, within your adjudication, compare each team within the pairing. So first you compare, like when we're looking at opening government, for example, we compare them both with opening opposition, but also the teams that come later. Was opening government more persuasive than closing government, or was opening government more persuasive than closing opposition? So we look at all of those pairs individually, and this is the way we can ensure that we actually do have an adjudication that is thought through and looks at the very clear debate analysis and the technicalities within that debate. I hope that is clear. So what this proceeds to, or before I go further on, I will go a note on role fulfillment, because I think that this is also crucial when you're judging BP debates due to the uniqueness of the format. So how do we credit certain things? So the key rule that everyone knows within BP debating is that the closing half teams, so the teams in closing government and closing opposition, always must have an extension. But an extension can be anything. It does not necessarily have to be an entirely new argument on a topic that has not been discussed before, but rather it can be things such as new analysis, new weighing, new rebuttal, new framing, anything that can be considered new. And in some judge manuals, it is even explicitly stated that we give teams we give them credit where credit is due, essentially meaning that if it is actually new, then that is something we should credit, even if it is not on a different topic, for example, from what their opening was doing. So how do we differentiate between opening and closing teams? Is essentially that closing teams also have the burden to weigh their material against their opening half team. They should say oh, we brought this new argument, or we brought this new framing, and this is how it fits into the debate. For example, they can say this argument is more important than the one opening government brought because it affects more people or affects a more vulnerable group or something like that. They could do it by saying they have this argument, we have this argument, ours is significantly more analytical, mechanistically well proven, and hence on an analytical quality, our material is stronger and therefore we win. Or, for example, they could do it by saying opening government tried to prove this thing, but they failed to do that analysis. We fill in that analysis gap and therefore reclaim their impacts. If it is actually true that they fill in the analytical gap that opening government had left, then in that situation, we do usually credit closing teams by saying that, yes, they were necessary for opening government to have their material proven, therefore CG takes over OG, for example. However, doing that weighing does not, if you don't do that weighing, that is not an automatic loss. You can still outweigh your opening half, even if you don't do that explicit type of weighing. But then that should be more obvious from, within the content. However, if we do have very tight clashes where I'm not really sure if we should credit opening government or closing government more, and their engagement with the rest of the teams is really similar, and closing half that hasn't done the weighing in terms of to prove why their analysis is more relevant, then that is something that can very easily tip the scales towards opening government in a tight call, because technically closing teams do have the burden to prove why their material is more important, because opening government does not have that opportunity as a team, because obviously they speak first and they cannot speak after closing government has spoken. Then in a really tight call, this is something that can be the tiebreaker by saying, well, you didn't do the weighing, therefore I as a judge have to weigh this type of thing. I cannot insert myself into the debate because you have the burden, you didn't feel that burden. This is something we credit opening half more on. And besides closing half teams, I think another thing is that if we are lacking direct engagement, then this is especially true when we have long diagonals or if we have diagonals. So for example, an opening government team, if we have to compare them to closing opposition, so they're on the far end of the debate and they have no direct engagement possible between them because they don't speak in any kind of they don't speak in order that one speaks after the another directly. In those types of situations, we do assess other things such as points of information, especially on diagonal teams. They should be taking POIs from their diagonal, especially if you're opening government, you should be taking your closing opposition and vice versa. This is something that can very easily show their engagement directly, but also, we assess the type of analysis that is within those speeches. So for example, if closing opposition does really, really strong rebuttal to opening government, it is new rebuttal and is really damaging to them, then that is something that opening government can lose out to. However, if the analysis of OG is significantly stronger, they perhaps have even had some rebuttal within their case, such as preempting what opposition teams might say. And even obviously they cannot do that to the full extent because they won't know what the opposition case says entirely. If that is there and their material is stronger and closing opposition does not do a good job of fulfilling their burden, then it's very easy also for opening government to take that direct clash. So we assess other things like POIs, rebuttal, and weighing. However, in some instances, that is absolutely not possible. And this is really a minority of those situations that I'm talking about here. In that situation, we should assess like in a very, how to say this, like in a very limited manner, insert yourself into the debate and have like the most limited set of assumptions possible in terms of saying like, okay, there is no weighing, there's absolutely no way I can weigh between those two teams. Then what am I as a globally informed citizen more likely to be persuaded by? But if you do this type of inserting yourself into the debate, you have to have a very clear explanation, both within the adjudication with other judges, but also when you're giving the oral adjudication to the debaters and explaining your call, that in that situation, you should be able to explain why you inserted yourself into the debate, why it was reasonable, and why it was the absolute necessary thing to do, and why that was the reason you placed one team over the other. However, I really want to emphasize that this is something that happens in absolute minority of situations and should not be the standard of what we revert to. Usually you are able to differentiate between teams based on the analysis they themselves are doing, and teams themselves should be doing the weighing between different teams of saying who is winning and who is not winning. So the next thing to keep in mind when adjudicating is holistic adjudication. So what this means essentially is judges should measure the contributions of a team to the persuasion of the side in a debate as it happens. So what this means essentially is consider their entire contributions as a whole, not just parts of the case, not just something that they labeled as an argument, but everything that comes out from that team, including points of information and including the engagement with other teams. This does not mean that we are counting arguments. So it does not mean that one team is winning because they had 3 arguments and another team had 1. If you do one argument really well and the other team does 3 arguments badly, then presumably that one argument that was done really well is the one that is going to win. So we assess their entire contribution and the strength of it rather than how many arguments they're presenting to the entirety of the debate. Secondly, we should not separate style, sophistication, originality when we are assessing speeches or when we are assessing teams. We are not giving more points to a team, or we're not giving a win to a team just because their argument sounded really elegantly or just because it was a very original argument that you did not think of. This is not something we award points on, but rather we look at the debate as a whole, as it happened, and how that specific argument did within that round and how it interacted with other teams. So we don't award points based on these types of things separately, but we rather look at the entire contribution as a whole. And this goes again also vice versa, in the sense if they don't do a specific argument that you were expecting from them, it doesn't matter because we are assessing the debate as it is happening in front of us. Thirdly, and I think I briefly mentioned this earlier, we are not crediting impacts if they are mechanistically unproven or underanalyzed. So if someone just claims to have some impacts, but they don't actually prove them, we cannot just independently credit that, but rather we have to look at their contribution as a whole and how well they were able to prove the things that they were claiming that they are actually proving. So essentially, we're crediting based on what was actually said within the debate. And yeah, here I have also outlined what I just said before. If it is impossible, we use the smallest and most reasonable available assumptions with an explanation as to why we cannot assess the debate based on how it was happening, but rather why we had to insert ourselves. But again, this is in very minority of situations. So this is generally the part of how we assess the debate and how we should view this as judges. There is a part in this also about rule violations, because as I started with the slide about how debating or teams win within the context of the constraints of the rules of BP format, and there are also certain rule violations. Crucially, there is no such thing as an automatic fourth, but rather we look at each team. There is nothing that a team can do within the debate that will grant them an automatic fourth. There might be other teams who do other things differently or worse. So we should not, this is not something that we should be doing. Instead, we should consider the specific rule violations and how they play out. So generally, the rule for rule violations, so rules meaning here the things that are outlined in the judging or the debating manual for a competition, but for example, the Euros manual, it says that certain things you're not allowed to do. This can be things such as new material in whip speeches or not taking POIs or other things. How we should assess this is essentially we look at the speech or we look at the rule violation and we just take that out of the assessment entirely. What this means is that, for example, if someone brings new material in a whip speech, we're not crediting the part that is bringing in new material, but we rather assess the rest of the speech and the quality and content of it. And technically, it is entirely possible that if someone brings 2 minutes of new material, the rest of that is something we discard, and the rest of the 5 minutes is such amazing analysis that is still able to win them to round, even if we discard this. And this is something we also flag, for example, in the oral adjudication. We say, oh, you brought new material in the whip speech. We didn't credit this. However, these things we did credit from your speech. And that is something we do. Alternatively, when there is a contradiction or you're knifing your opening team. So essentially what a contradiction means is something that two things that cannot be true at the same time, or you're saying something that entirely contradicts something that your opening said. This is not allowed under the rules of BP. This is material that we do ignore as a judge, and we just don't assess this. Again, it's kind of like the new material in whip. We just take it out of the adjudication, and we do assess material that is actually non-contradictory or is able to exist within that debate. But analysis that is presented as an even if analysis, so essentially you're presenting different ways arguments could play out, or for example saying, even if the way OG characterized this is not true or doesn't happen, or opposition is able to say it doesn't happen, we say the alternative way this can play out is this. This is not something that is a contradiction, hence we should not treat it as such, and we should still credit that type of material. In the end then, when someone has violated a rule and we have removed that rule violation or that advantage they may gain from violating that rule from assessment, we should not further penalize those speakers. So we shouldn't say, oh, this was a 75 speech, but because they violated the rule, they're getting a 73. But rather we should look at the parts where we haven't assessed the speech and then give a speaker score based on the speech that we did see happen, excluding those types of violations. However, we do penalize for actively harming the debate, e.g. squirreling. So essentially what that means is, for example, when you define the motion entirely unfairly and something that is like goes against the motion or goes against the burdens that team has within that motion or on their side, then this is something that does kind of penalize you also automatically within the round. This is something that gives other teams advantages because they can refute you, but also it generally does reflect on the performance of the team in the round. It shows how well you are doing within the round if you define something as entirely unreasonably. I hope this is clear. But again, I think this is something that doesn't happen super often. And so the more common approach is that we ignore the rule violations or we ignore the contributions that come from the rule violations. So this is the part about what are the judging principles when we're doing this as an adjudicator and trying to decide the winner. Now going to the process of actually deciding who won a specific debate. So in my opinion, coming to the decision part, when you're a judge, you're looking after the debate has ended, you have to now decide which team is winning the debate. You have written down all of the contributions of every single team. What I also like to do is, so I usually, the flow that I have is like I write down everything a team says as best to my abilities for every speaker of the team. And then I usually have a separate sheet of paper where I have, drawn a cross on it with every team having its own space, and on there I just kind of highlight the most important parts of every team's case, and this gives me like a broad overview of what each team brought to the table and how they interact with each other. In my opinion, I think the easiest, especially if you're a beginner judge, way to come to the decision is to compare teams chronologically, i.e. as you go, for example, the top half is ending and you're saying, okay, I think opening government beat opening opposition, but this is essentially, but also after the debate has ended, this is essentially how you approach this by looking at, okay, this team comes in, this team comes in. And I think this is an approach I also use personally when giving oral adjudications, because I think this is a really easy way to keep track of where you are as a judge, and it's easier to keep track of for debaters as well when we explain, okay, opening government brought this, opening opposition brought this is a fast comparison. And so I've also Handel made a little chart here. So when I'm looking at the debate has ended, I'm first comparing opening government and opening opposition as a team themselves. And the arrow is showing if it is pointing to one team, then that team that it's pointing to wins that clash. So for example, opening government brings some arguments, but OO has better analysis and is better able to refute the stuff that opening government brings. Therefore, I conclude that the top half was lost, opening government lost to opening opposition. And this is kind of the pairwise comparisons that we are doing, and we're not considering at all what CG and CO were doing that when we're simply looking at opening government. The next team then that enters the comparison chronologically is closing government. And when assessing that, it is up to you personally if you first want to compare them with their opening or with their diagonal. But for example, here I started with the comparison between closing government and opening government. So there I uniquely look at the contributions I got from OG and the contributions I got from CG. And let's say CG did good analysis and they did excellent weighing, that they are their analysis is significantly more important because reasons X, Y, Z. Therefore, I only look at those two teams without considering the rest of the teams, and I say CG won this clash between opening government and closing government. The next thing I compare is CG with OO, again ignoring entirely what opening government, or not entirely, but ignoring what opening government was saying within this clash and saying how the analysis that CG brought compares to the analysis that opening opposition brought, and how well they were able to engage with each other, both with direct rebuttal, but also through things such as POIs. Here in this example, I have concluded that, closing government was better, they had better analysis, and they were able to outweigh whatever opening opposition was doing. And this is the first triangle of the debate done. And then we bring in closing opposition, which naturally brings in 3 more comparisons. So firstly, closing opposition, again, based on preference, how you want to go. But let's say you want to start with comparing the bottom half teams, then you just compare the contribution of both bottom half teams, say CG brought this, CO brought this. One was better able to, so in this example, CG was better able to analyze both the substantive content that they have, but also weighed why their material is more important than the stuff CO brings. Therefore, CG wins over CO. And then as a final thing, we compare to the opening half teams. I put them together in the slide, but again, you first look at opening opposition versus closing opposition on an individual level. And then lastly, you look at, for example, the long diagonal comparison of saying, okay, OG brought this, CO brought this. How do I compare these two materials? How do they interact with each other? Did they do POIs? So essentially, you go chronologically. I think this is the easiest way. Alternatively, you can start based on the most contentious issues or any other way, but I think this is a very clear way of how you should do pairwise comparisons between the teams and individually assess the type of contributions that they had. So the outcome of this team, essentially, as you see most arrows pointing to closing government, then the next is closing opposition, and then we have opening opposition and opening government. Sometimes it may happen that the arrows don't equal out to a very direct call, and I think in that situation you really have to assess how the individual contributions are and see how they relate to the rest of the debate. But I think this is an easy way if you have those arrows or you're clear about which team won which comparison or which pairing. I think this makes it a lot easier to assess and come to a final conclusion about how the entire call should be. So here, CG would be 1, CO2, OO, and then OG. If you're adjudicating within a panel, then this is something that also happens on a panel level. So usually what happens in panel adjudication, where you usually have, let's say 3 people, then the chair judge is the one leading the discussion and getting information from everyone and leading the discussion in general about how people see this debate. Within BP judging, I have yet to see an instance where there is no consensus judging. So I think consensus judging is the norm. What this means is that the entire panel essentially comes to one broad conclusion. So usually how a panel adjudication goes about, generally there's 15 minutes of time for this, is that everyone comes to an initial call independently, done in a couple of minutes or already by the end of the debate, depending on how clear or not clear the debate was. And usually the chair gets everyone's initial call, starting with their wing judges, and then finally saying their own initial call. And then based on that, you can already see kind of what is the vibe of the panel. Does everyone seem to be in broad agreement? Sometimes the calls can be wildly different, where someone has given a fourth to someone someone else has given a first. So depending on the type of call and how messy it is, the chair should lead the discussion on actually what are the disagreements and contentious calls. And I think that is something you usually start with. Here are different approaches. People decide on different ways how they want to lead that type of discussion. I think it depends on the specific debate, but I think an easy way to go about is chronologically, but that might not be always the best use of time. But the crucial thing is to get rid of all of the disagreements to the best to the maximum extent possible. And then also you have to always discuss all of the other positions as well, so even non-contentious clashes. So for example, if you were deciding, oh, we don't know who's going to come second or third, and that takes up like 7 minutes of your discussion time, then you should still in the end have time to talk through all of the other positions, even if someone plays the devil's advocate or is asking questions specifically about, like, I saw the debate this way, I saw it this way, but you should generally come to a broad consensus or an understanding at least of why everyone decided the way it is. So in the end, this culminates basically with coming to a decision. The entire panel comes to one decision, but it is allowed to have split decisions. So someone can say, I decide differently, but in the end, because you should usually have either 3 people, or if you have a 2-people panel, then the chair is the judge with the most authority. Then in that situation, you have the split decision, but it is still on paper reflected as one consensus decision. It is just something you tell the debaters that, oh, we had a split here, and this is how it went, and the majority of the panel was on this opinion. And then after that, you also submit a ballot together, or independently, depending on the type of competition you're at, but everyone decides together on the speaker points, again, led by the chair judge, and everyone has to agree on the same type of speaker points. So sometimes this reflects splits, but this is based on the speaker scale and how you see the debate happen. And crucially, giving speaker points happens after you have given the call. It has to be consistent with the call, meaning that there are no low point wins, and this is it reflects the outcome of the debate based on the team with the highest, the team who got first gets the highest amount of speaks collectively, and then so on, going until the end. This should be done based on the speaker scale and after team placings. And what I really want to emphasize here is that the speaker scale is actually really useful. So I have taken an outtake of a very, I think, the most average range of BP debates that we usually see. And I do think that the speaker scale is really useful for giving speaker scores. And you can read out, or the chair ideally should read out, the bracket that they're talking about. So for example, let's say I'm sensing that the debater was in the 76 to 78 speaker scale. And then you see, does it actually match up with the description set there? Are the arguments almost exclusively relevant? Do they address the core issues? Do they occasionally, but not often, fall into deficits and explanations? Are they clear to follow? And then if it feels like, should we go up? Oh, are they actually really relevant without any logical gaps, or should we go down? And then within the bracket, you decide, do you think it's on the high end of that bracket or the low end of that bracket? And I really do believe that the speaker scale is really useful when giving speaker scores. And so that is basically the end of the adjudication process. I don't have any other like content-based slides, but I think that is the broad thing. And I think in general, adjudication becomes easier when you have practice with it. One way to practice this is by watching a debate that has been uploaded online and you know the result of it based on like previous tab results. This is easier, for example, for Euros and Worlds rounds, and seeing if you came to the same decision as the panel did in that specific debate. Not all panels are perfect, but this is one way to practice it if you've had limited practice beforehand. And if you just keep those principles in mind, you're non-interventionist and you're kind of just observing the debate. And crucially, you're just comparing teams pairwise and looking at their contributions. It is not super difficult, and just you get better with practice, but those are the broad principles of judging. Does anyone have any questions here? If not, then I thank you very much for your attention and wish you a good rest of the day.